The morning sun cast long shadows across the parade ground as Captain Sarah Mitchell stepped out of her jeep. The dust kicked up by her boots settled slowly in the dry air of Fort Henderson. She could hear the distant sounds of cadets running drills, their voices carrying across the base like echoes of determination and exhaustion. Sarah had arrived 3 days early, before the official start of the training program. She wanted to observe, to understand what she was walking into. The Advanced Leadership Training course was known throughout the military as one of the most demanding programs available. Only the best officers were selected, and even fewer completed it successfully. At 28, Sarah had already earned respect in her previous assignments. She had led troops through difficult missions overseas, managed complex logistics operations, and proven herself capable under pressure. But she knew that walking into this program would be different. She would be one of only 3 women in a class of 45 officers. The base itself was impressive. Built in the 1940s, it had been modernized over the decades but still maintained the solid, no-nonsense architecture of military installations. The barracks were arranged in neat rows, with the command buildings forming a central hub. Training facilities spread out in all directions, from obstacle courses to classroom buildings to specialized simulation centers. Sarah made her way to the administration building to complete her check-in process. The clerk, a young corporal with nervous energy, handed her a thick folder of paperwork and orientation materials. The schedule was intense: 14 weeks of leadership challenges, tactical exercises, psychological evaluations, and practical command scenarios. "Ma'am, your quarters are in Building C, Room 247, the corporal informed her. "The other officers in your program have been arriving since yesterday. Orientation begins tomorrow at 0600 hours. Sarah nodded and made her way across the base. The late afternoon sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. She passed groups of cadets heading to evening mess, their conversations a mix of excitement and nervousness about the challenges ahead. Building C was a 3-story structure that housed visiting officers and students in various programs. As Sarah climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor, she could hear voices from other rooms. Some officers were already forming informal groups, sharing stories about their backgrounds and speculating about what the next few months would bring. Her room was small but functional: a single bed, a desk, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the training fields. Sarah unpacked her belongings methodically, arranging her uniforms in the closet and setting up her desk with the materials she would need for the program. As evening approached, she decided to take a walk around the base to familiarize herself with the layout. The dining hall was buzzing with activity as officers from various programs gathered for dinner. Sarah entered quietly and found a table near the back where she could observe without drawing too much attention. The conversations around her were typical of military gatherings: discussions of previous assignments, speculation about instructors, and the kind of good-natured competition that was common among ambitious officers. Sarah listened as she ate, gathering information about the program and the people she would be training alongside. At a nearby table, she overheard a group of male officers discussing the upcoming training. Their conversation was loud enough that she couldn't help but hear their comments about the women in the program. "I heard there are 3 females this time," one said, cutting into his steak. "That's more than usual." "Yeah, well, they probably won't last long," another replied. "This program isn't designed for people who need special accommodations." "The instructors are tough," a third officer added. "They don't go easy on anyone, regardless of gender. If someone can't keep up, they're out." Sarah continued eating, her expression neutral. She had heard similar comments throughout her career and had learned not to react publicly. Instead, she filed the information away and continued her quiet observation of the group dynamics already forming among the trainees. After dinner, Sarah returned to her room and spent the evening reviewing the orientation materials. The program was structured around real-world leadership challenges, with officers taking turns commanding simulated units through various scenarios. The evaluations would be constant, with instructors observing every decision, every interaction, every moment of stress or success. The next morning arrived with the sharp sound of a bugle call at 0530 hours. Sarah was already awake, having maintained her usual early rising routine. She dressed in her physical training uniform and made her way to the designated assembly area. The parade ground was filled with 45 officers standing in formation as the sun rose over the eastern horizon. Sarah took her assigned position, noting the curious glances from some of her fellow trainees. She maintained her military bearing, eyes forward, posture straight. Major Richards, the program director, stood before the group. He was a tall man with gray hair and the kind of presence that commanded immediate attention. His uniform was perfectly pressed, his bearing that of someone who had spent decades in leadership positions. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the formation, "welcome to the Advanced Leadership Training course. For the next 14 weeks, you will be challenged in ways you may not have experienced before. This program has a completion rate of 68%. Some of you will not finish." He paused, allowing his words to sink in before continuing. "You are here because you have demonstrated leadership potential in your previous assignments. But potential means nothing if you cannot execute under pressure. You will command simulated units, make decisions with incomplete information, and be evaluated on your ability to lead others in difficult circumstances." The major walked along the front of the formation, making eye contact with individual officers as he spoke. "There are no shortcuts in this program. There are no favors. Your success or failure depends entirely on your ability to perform. We don't care about your previous rank, your connections, or your background. We care only about your ability to lead." Sarah felt the weight of his gaze as he passed her position, but his expression revealed nothing. She maintained her focus, knowing that this first impression would set the tone for everything that followed. "Your first exercise begins immediately after this formation," Major Richards continued. "You will be divided into teams and given your first leadership challenge. The exercise will continue for 72 hours with minimal breaks. Those who cannot maintain performance standards will be counseled and, if necessary, removed from the program." The formation was dismissed, and the officers were directed to different areas based on team assignments posted on a nearby board. Sarah checked her name and found herself assigned to Team Alpha, along with 8 other officers. As they gathered in their designated area, she quickly assessed her teammates. There was Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, a veteran infantry officer with combat experience and a reputation for demanding excellence. Captain Mike Chen, an engineer with expertise in logistics and planning. Captain Robert Taylor, a pilot with experience in close air support operations. The team also included officers from artillery, intelligence, and special operations backgrounds. Sarah realized immediately that she was not only the only woman on the team but also one of the younger officers by rank and experience. The team dynamics would be crucial to their success, and she knew that earning respect would require demonstrating competence rather than demanding it. Their first challenge was announced by Captain Williams, one of the program instructors. The scenario involved commanding a simulated infantry company that had been ambushed while conducting a patrol in hostile territory. The team would need to coordinate evacuation of casualties, establish security, and complete the original mission objectives within a limited time frame. The exercise would take place in a realistic training environment with actors playing the roles of soldiers, civilians, and enemy forces. Electronic systems would simulate weapons fire, explosions, and communication disruptions. The stress would be as real as possible without actual danger. As Team Alpha gathered around the tactical maps and situation reports, Sarah noticed the subtle way her teammates positioned themselves. Without any formal discussion, they had unconsciously arranged themselves so that she was somewhat separated from the main group. It wasn't necessarily intentional, but it reflected assumptions about her role in the team dynamic. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison took charge of the initial planning, which was appropriate given his rank and experience. However, Sarah noticed several tactical considerations that weren't being addressed in the preliminary discussion. She waited for an appropriate moment to contribute, knowing that timing would be important. "Sir," she said during a brief pause in the conversation, "I'd like to suggest we consider the civilian population factor in our planning. The scenario briefing mentioned local nationals in the area, and that could significantly impact our tactical options." Morrison looked at her for a moment, then nodded. "Good point. What do you recommend? Sarah moved to the map and pointed to several key locations. If we're dealing with a mixed civilian and military environment, we'll need to establish clear rules of engagement that protect non-combatants while maintaining tactical effectiveness. I recommend designating specific routes for civilian evacuation and ensuring our simulated soldiers understand the distinction between legitimate targets and protected persons. The suggestion led to a more detailed discussion of the tactical plan, with each team member contributing based on their areas of expertise. Sarah continued to participate actively, offering insights drawn from her own combat experience and training. As the exercise preparation continued, she began to notice changes in how her teammates interacted with her. The initial distance was gradually replaced by professional respect as her contributions proved valuable. However, she also sensed that some of the officers were still evaluating her, waiting to see how she would perform under pressure. The exercise began with simulated radio communications reporting the ambush. Team Alpha was thrust immediately into the chaos of a combat situation, with multiple priorities demanding attention simultaneously. Sarah found herself assigned to coordinate the evacuation of simulated casualties while Morrison directed the overall tactical response. The training environment was remarkably realistic. Blank ammunition created authentic sound effects, while smoke machines and electronic simulation systems provided visual and auditory chaos that replicated combat conditions. Actors playing wounded soldiers called out for help, while others simulated enemy fire from concealed positions. Sarah moved quickly between positions, coordinating with team members to establish casualty collection points and evacuation routes. The physical demands were significant, requiring her to run between locations while carrying equipment and maintaining communication with the command post. During one particularly intense moment, she found herself crawling through a simulated minefield to reach a group of wounded soldiers. The electronic sensors detected her movement and provided feedback about the success of her navigation. Behind her, she could hear the ongoing tactical discussion as Morrison and the other team members worked to complete the mission objectives. The exercise continued through the night, with team members rotating through different leadership positions as the scenario evolved. Sarah took command during a phase that required coordinating a counterattack against the simulating enemy positions. Drawing on her training and experience, she directed the simulated infantry through a complex tactical maneuver that successfully neutralized the threat. By dawn, Team Alpha had completed all primary objectives and most of the secondary goals. The exhaustion was real, despite the simulated nature of the combat. Officers had been operating on minimal sleep while maintaining high performance standards under constant evaluation. Major Richards appeared as the exercise concluded, accompanied by several instructors who had been observing throughout the night. Their notebooks were filled with observations and assessments that would determine each officer's progress in the program. Effective leadership, the Major announced to the assembled teams, requires the ability to perform consistently under adverse conditions. Last night's exercise was designed to evaluate your decision-making, communication skills, and ability to adapt to changing circumstances. Sarah stood with her teammates, aware that the real evaluation was just beginning. The next several months would present increasingly difficult challenges, and her performance in this first exercise had established expectations for everything that followed. As they walked back toward the barracks for a brief rest period, Lieutenant Colonel Morrison fell into step beside her. "You did well out there," he said quietly. "Your tactical suggestions during the planning phase made a significant difference in our success." Sarah nodded her appreciation for the acknowledgement. "Thank you, sir. I'm looking forward to the next challenges." What she didn't say was that she had already begun to notice patterns in how some of the other officers interacted with her. There were subtle signs of skepticism, small comments that suggested some trainees still viewed her presence in the program as experimental rather than earned. She knew that each exercise would require her to prove herself again, regardless of previous successes. The Advanced Leadership Training course was designed to test every aspect of military leadership, from tactical decision-making to personnel management to crisis response. Sarah understood that succeeding would require not only demonstrating her capabilities but also overcoming assumptions and biases that had nothing to do with her qualifications. As she prepared for whatever challenges lay ahead, she reflected on the words of her first commanding officer years earlier, leadership isn't about proving you belong. It's about making everyone around you better at their jobs. That philosophy had guided her throughout her career, and she knew it would be essential in the weeks ahead. The second week of the advanced leadership training course brought new challenges that tested different aspects of command capability. Sarah had settled into the demanding routine of the program, but she noticed that some of her fellow officers seemed determined to find reasons to question her presence. The morning briefing took place in a sterile classroom with maps covering every wall. Captain Williams outlined the next exercise, a complex urban warfare simulation that would require teams to coordinate with civilian authorities while conducting military operations in a simulated city environment. This exercise will test your ability to operate in environments where military objectives must be balanced against civilian concerns, Captain Williams explained. You'll be working with local government officials, managing media relations, and ensuring that military actions don't compromise long-term strategic goals. Sarah found herself assigned to Team Bravo for this exercise, working with a different group of officers. The team leader was Major Patricia Stevens, one of the other two women in the program. Sarah was curious to see how the dynamics would differ from her previous team experience. Major Stevens was a seasoned logistics officer with experience in humanitarian operations. She had a calm, methodical approach that contrasted with the more aggressive style favored by many combat arms officers. As the team gathered for initial planning, Sarah noticed that several male officers seemed to defer less readily to Stevens than they had to Morrison in the previous exercise. Captain David Reeves, an armor officer with a reputation for direct communication, was particularly vocal during the planning session. "Ma'am, I think we're overcomplicating this," he said when Stevens outlined a careful approach that prioritized minimizing civilian disruption. "The objective is clear: secure the area and neutralize threats. We can worry about public relations after we've completed the mission." Stevens maintained her composure. "Captain, the scenario specifically emphasizes that our long-term strategic objectives depend on maintaining civilian support. If we alienate the local population, we may win today's battle but lose the overall campaign." Sarah watched the exchange carefully. She could see that Reeves and some of the other officers were testing Stevens' authority, probing to see how she would handle disagreement. It was a dynamic she had observed before in her career. Male officers who would accept direction from male superiors without question sometimes felt compelled to challenge female leaders, often under the guise of offering tactical expertise. "I agree with Major Stevens," Sarah said during a pause in the discussion. "In my experience with similar operations, civilian cooperation can be the difference between mission success and mission failure. If we approach this purely as a tactical problem, we're likely to create strategic complications." Reeves turned his attention to her. "Captain Mitchell, this is a training exercise. The focus should be on military effectiveness, not political considerations." "Actually, Captain Reeves," Sarah replied evenly, "modern military operations almost always involve political considerations. Ignoring them in training means we're not preparing for real-world conditions." The tension in the room was palpable. Sarah realized that her support of Stevens had been interpreted by some officers as evidence of gender-based loyalty rather than professional judgment. She made a mental note to be more careful about how her contributions might be perceived, while also recognizing the unfairness of having to consider such factors. Major Stevens used the moment to reassert control of the planning process. "We'll proceed with an approach that balances tactical requirements with strategic objectives. Captain Chen, I want you to work with Captain Mitchell on developing rules of engagement that protect civilians while maintaining operational effectiveness. Captain Reeves, you'll coordinate with the simulated local authorities to ensure our operations don't interfere with essential services." The assignment of tasks was skillful, giving each officer important responsibilities while making it clear that Stevens remained in command. Sarah found herself paired with Captain Chen, the engineer she had worked with during the first exercise. As they developed the rules of engagement, Chen shared his observations about the program dynamics. "The instructors are watching everything," he said quietly. "Not just our tactical performance, but how we work together, how we handle disagreement, how we support or undermine team cohesion." Sarah nodded. "I've noticed that too. Some of the challenges seem designed specifically to create interpersonal tension. The question is whether that's intentional, Chen continued. Are they testing our ability to work together despite differences, or are they evaluating how we handle conflict when it arises? The conversation was interrupted by the beginning of the exercise. Team Bravo was transported to a mock urban environment where they would spend the next 48 hours managing a complex scenario involving military operations, civilian evacuation, and media scrutiny. The simulated city was impressive in its detail. Buildings had been constructed to replicate urban environments, complete with multiple stories, narrow streets, and realistic obstacles. Actors played the roles of civilians, government officials, and media representatives, while opposing forces were represented by other training units. Sarah's first assignment was to coordinate with the simulated mayor and city council to establish evacuation routes for civilians. The actors playing these roles had been instructed to present realistic challenges, concerns about economic impact, questions about authority, and demands for information that might compromise operational security. Captain Mitchell, the actor playing the mayor, said during their initial meeting, "My primary responsibility is to the citizens of this city. I need assurance that your military operations won't endanger civilians or destroy infrastructure that's essential for post-conflict recovery." Sarah had prepared for this type of discussion. "Mr. Mayor, our objective is to secure the area with minimal disruption to civilian life. We've developed specific protocols to protect essential services and ensure that evacuation procedures don't create unnecessary hardship for residents." The negotiation continued for an hour, with the mayor raising concerns about specific neighborhoods, questioning the necessity of certain military actions, and demanding guarantees that Sarah couldn't provide. Throughout the discussion, she maintained a balance between military requirements and civilian concerns, finding creative solutions to seemingly incompatible demands. Meanwhile, other team members were dealing with their own challenges. Reeves was coordinating with simulated military units to establish security perimeters, while Stevens managed overall operations from a temporary command post. The exercise was designed to create multiple competing priorities that required constant communication and adjustment. During the second day of the exercise, Sarah faced her most difficult challenge yet. While coordinating civilian evacuations, she received reports of simulated enemy activity in a residential area where families were still present. The tactical solution was clear: secure the area immediately using available military assets. However, the civilian authorities were demanding that evacuations be completed before any military action was taken. Sarah found herself caught between competing demands from her military superiors and civilian authorities. Major Stevens was under pressure to neutralize the threat quickly, while the simulated mayor was threatening to withdraw all cooperation if military operations endangered civilians who hadn't yet been evacuated. The situation required rapid decision-making under intense pressure. Sarah analyzed the available options and developed a proposal that addressed both concerns: a phased operation that would secure civilian evacuation routes first, then systematically clear the area of threats while maintaining protected corridors for any remaining civilians. She presented the plan to both Stevens and the mayor, explaining how it balanced military effectiveness with civilian protection. The proposal required precise timing and coordination, but it offered a solution that both sides could accept. "The risk is that we give the enemy time to prepare defenses," Stevens pointed out during the briefing. "If they use the delay to strengthen their positions, our casualties could be higher." "That's true, ma'am," Sarah acknowledged. "But if we proceed without completing civilian evacuation, we risk creating an international incident that could compromise our entire mission. The tactical risk may be acceptable if it prevents strategic failure." Stevens considered the recommendation for several minutes, weighing the competing factors. Around them, the exercise continued with radio communications, status reports, and the constant pressure of multiple ongoing operations. "Approved," Stevens finally decided. "Captain Mitchell, you'll coordinate the phased operation. I want updates every 15 minutes on both civilian evacuation progress and enemy activity." The execution of the plan required Sarah to coordinate simultaneously with military units, civilian authorities, and international observers who were monitoring the exercise for compliance with rules of engagement. She found herself running between command posts, briefing different audiences, and adapting to changing circumstances as the simulation evolved. The physical demands were significant, but Sarah had trained extensively for such conditions throughout her career. More challenging was the mental pressure of making decisions that affected multiple complex objectives while being continuously evaluated by instructors who recorded every choice, every communication, and every moment of hesitation or confidence. During one particularly intense period, Sarah received conflicting reports about civilian locations. Military reconnaissance suggested that a particular building was clear of non-combatants, while civilian authorities insisted that families were still sheltering inside. The decision about how to proceed would determine whether the military operation could advance or whether additional delays would be necessary. Sarah quickly organized a joint military-civilian team to conduct a thorough search of the contested building. The search revealed that both reports were partially correct. The building contained civilians in areas that hadn't been detected by military reconnaissance. Her decision to verify rather than assume had prevented a simulated tragedy that would have compromised the entire mission. As the exercise concluded, Sarah reflected on the lessons learned. The challenge hadn't been purely military or purely civilian, it had required integrating multiple perspectives and finding solutions that addressed complex, often contradictory requirements. Major Richards appeared for the after-action review, accompanied by a team of instructors who had been observing throughout the exercise. Sarah noticed that their attention seemed particularly focused on how the teams had handled interpersonal dynamics and coordination challenges. Effective leadership in modern military operations, Major Richards began, requires the ability to work with diverse stakeholders who may have competing priorities. This exercise tested your ability to balance military objectives with civilian concerns, coordinate with non-military authorities, and maintain team cohesion under pressure. The individual feedback sessions that followed were intense and detailed. Sarah met with Captain Williams, who had been observing her performance throughout the exercise. "Captain Mitchell, your approach to the civilian coordination challenges was particularly noteworthy," Williams said, reviewing his extensive notes. "You demonstrated the ability to find creative solutions to complex problems while maintaining operational effectiveness. However, I want to discuss your interactions with some of your teammates." Sarah had been expecting this conversation. "Yes, sir. There were moments when your contributions were interpreted as challenging authority rather than offering professional input," Williams continued. "I'm not suggesting that you were wrong to speak up, but I want you to consider how your communication style might be perceived by others." The feedback was frustrating because Sarah recognized the double standard it represented. Male officers who offered the same types of contributions were praised for initiative and tactical thinking. When she offered similar input, it was scrutinized for evidence of insubordination or failure to respect hierarchy. "Sir, I believe my contributions were appropriate and professionally presented," she replied carefully. "If there are specific instances where my communication was inappropriate, I'd appreciate specific feedback so I can adjust accordingly." Williams nodded. "I'm not criticizing your performance, Captain. I'm pointing out that leadership sometimes requires adapting your approach based on how others perceive your actions, regardless of whether those perceptions are fair or accurate." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, covering various aspects of her performance. Sarah received high marks for tactical decision-making, problem-solving, and adaptability. The concerns focused primarily on interpersonal dynamics and the perception of her role within team structures. That evening, Sarah found herself in conversation with Major Stevens as they prepared for the next day's activities. Stevens had received similar feedback about perception and communication style, despite having successfully led her team through a complex exercise. "The frustrating part," Stevens said quietly, "is that we're being evaluated not just on our actual performance, but on how our performance is received by others. We have to be better than male officers just to be considered equal, and then we're criticized for being too aggressive or not collaborative enough." Sarah understood the dilemma. Throughout her career, she had navigated similar challenges, constantly adjusting her approach to find the narrow path between being dismissed as too passive and criticized as too assertive. "The question is whether we try to change perceptions or focus entirely on performance," Sarah said. "Sometimes I think the energy spent on managing others' perceptions could be better used on actually doing the job. But if managing perceptions is part of leadership, then, ignoring it could be a mistake, Stevens replied. The challenge is figuring out which battles are worth fighting and which ones are distractions from more important objectives. As Sarah prepared for sleep, she considered the lessons from the day's exercise. The military challenges had been demanding but manageable, drawing on skills and training she had developed throughout her career. The interpersonal challenges were more complex, requiring her to navigate assumptions and biases that had nothing to do with military effectiveness. She knew that the remaining weeks of the program would present even more difficult tests, both tactical and personal. Her success would depend not only on her ability to perform under pressure but also on her skill in working with teammates who might question her presence or interpret her actions through the lens of gender rather than competence. The Advanced Leadership Training course was designed to prepare officers for the most challenging command positions in the military. Sarah was beginning to understand that for women in the program, the challenge included elements that their male counterparts never had to consider. The question was whether she could excel despite those additional obstacles, or find ways to turn them into advantages through superior preparation and performance. The 6th week of the program brought a shift in dynamics that Sarah hadn't anticipated. Several officers had already been removed from the course for various reasons, and those who remained had settled into established patterns of interaction and cooperation. However, Sarah noticed that a small group of officers had begun actively undermining her performance in subtle but deliberate ways. The behavior started during a complex logistics exercise that required teams to coordinate supply lines for multiple units operating in different geographic areas. Sarah had been assigned as the deputy commander for Team Charlie, working under Captain Frank Rodriguez, an experienced quartermaster officer with excellent organizational skills. The exercise scenario involved managing fuel, ammunition, medical supplies, and food distribution for simulated combat units spread across a wide area. Weather conditions were simulated to complicate transportation, and enemy activity threatened supply routes at various points. Success required precise timing, clear communication, and the ability to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. Sarah's primary responsibility was coordinating helicopter resupply operations with ground transportation networks. The task required detailed knowledge of aircraft capabilities, landing zone requirements, and security protocols. She had prepared extensively, studying flight operations manuals and consulting with pilots about realistic limitations and procedures. During the initial planning phase, Captain Brad Wilson approached with suggested modifications to her helicopter coordination plan. Wilson was a pilot himself, with experience in combat supply operations, and his suggestions seemed reasonable at first glance. "Captain Mitchell," he said during a break in the planning session, "I think you might want to reconsider some of these landing zones. Based on my experience, some of these locations could be problematic for the aircraft you're planning to use." Sarah reviewed his suggestions carefully. The changes would simplify some aspects of the operation but would also require longer flight times and reduce the overall efficiency of the resupply network. She analyzed the trade-offs and concluded that her original plan offered better overall performance, despite the additional complexity. "I appreciate the input, Captain Wilson," she replied. "However, I believe the original plan provides better coverage with acceptable risk levels. The landing zones I've selected offer better security and shorter ground transportation distances." Wilson persisted with his suggestions, providing increasingly detailed technical arguments about aircraft limitations and weather factors. Other officers gathered around as the discussion continued, and Sarah began to realize that the conversation had become a public test of her technical knowledge and decision-making confidence. "Captain Mitchell," Wilson said with apparent concern, "I'm not trying to second-guess your work, but I've got significant flight time in these aircraft types. The performance characteristics you're assuming might not be realistic under these conditions." Sarah had encountered this type of challenge before. Wilson was using his specialized expertise to question her competence in an area where she couldn't claim equal experience. However, she had done thorough research and consulted with subject matter experts during her preparation. "Captain Wilson, I understand your concerns," she said calmly. "My plan is based on the technical specifications provided in the exercise materials, consultation with flight operations personnel, and analysis of similar operations conducted under comparable conditions. If you have specific data that contradicts these sources, I'd be happy to review it. The exchange continued for several more minutes, with Wilson pressing increasingly technical questions about rotor wash effects, altitude density impacts, and fuel consumption calculations. Sarah answered each question accurately, drawing on her preparation and demonstrating solid understanding of the operational factors involved. Other officers watched the exchange with obvious interest. Sarah realized that this had become an informal evaluation of her credibility, with Wilson serving as a proxy for others who questioned her technical competence. Her responses would influence not only this exercise but her standing within the remaining group of officers. Captain Rodriguez intervened before the discussion could escalate further. "Both plans have merit," he announced. "Captain Mitchell, proceed with your original approach. Captain Wilson, I want you to develop contingency plans in case weather or enemy activity requires modifications to the primary plan." The solution was diplomatic but clear. Rodriguez had supported Sarah's plan while giving Wilson a face-saving alternative assignment. However, Sarah noticed that several officers seemed disappointed that the challenge to her authority hadn't been more successful. As the exercise progressed, Sarah found herself facing additional challenges that seemed designed to test her resilience and adaptability. Equipment failures, communication disruptions, and changes in enemy activity all required rapid adjustments to her carefully planned helicopter operations. During one particularly stressful period, 2 helicopter missions were delayed simultaneously due to simulated weather conditions, while ground units reported urgent need for medical supplies and ammunition. Sarah had to restructure the entire resupply schedule, coordinate with ground transportation units, and maintain communication with multiple command posts while working with incomplete information. The pressure was intense, with radio communications crackling with updates, requests for information, and reports of changing conditions. Sarah worked at a bank of radios and computer terminals, tracking multiple aircraft, monitoring ground unit status, and coordinating with weather forecasters and intelligence analysts. Captain Wilson appeared at her workstation during the height of the crisis. "Captain Mitchell, I've been monitoring your communications with the aircraft," he said. "I think you might be pushing the pilots harder than the conditions allow. Maybe we should consider scaling back some of these missions." Sarah paused in her work and looked at him directly. "Captain Wilson, the ground units need these supplies to continue their missions. The weather window is narrow but manageable according to the Flight Operations Center. Unless you have specific information suggesting imminent danger to aircraft, I intend to proceed with the current plan." "I'm just concerned about flight safety," Wilson replied. "These margins you're working with don't leave much room for unexpected problems." "I appreciate your concern," Sarah said firmly. However, balancing operational requirements with safety considerations is exactly what this exercise is designed to test. "I've consulted with the appropriate authorities and made my decision based on all available information." The exchange was brief, but other officers in the command post had heard it clearly. Sarah returned to her work, coordinating the complex resupply operations while maintaining awareness of the broader implications of her decisions. The helicopter missions proceeded successfully, delivering critical supplies to ground units within the required timeframes. Sarah's coordination allowed the exercise to continue without significant delays or compromises to mission objectives. However, she noticed that Wilson seemed dissatisfied with the successful outcome. Later that day, during a break between exercise phases, Sarah overheard a conversation between Wilson and 2 other officers. They were discussing her performance, and their comments made it clear that the challenges she had faced were not coincidental. "She's stubborn," Wilson was saying. "Doesn't listen to input from people with more experience in specific areas." "I noticed that too," added Captain Mark Stevens, an artillery officer. During the urban exercise, she seemed more interested in proving herself right than finding the best solution. The third officer, Lieutenant Colonel Alex Torres, was more diplomatic but equally critical. "Look, I'm sure she's competent, but this program is about learning to work with others. If someone can't take constructive criticism, that's a leadership problem." Sarah realized that she was facing an organized effort to undermine her credibility. The challenges to her technical decisions, the persistent questioning of her judgment, and the subsequent discussions about her attitude were part of a pattern designed to create doubt about her suitability for the program. The situation required careful handling. If she confronted the officers directly, she would be labeled as confrontational or unable to handle criticism. If she ignored the behavior, it would likely escalate and could influence other officers who were still forming opinions about her capabilities. Sarah decided to document the incidents while focusing primarily on exceptional performance that would speak for itself. She began keeping detailed notes about interactions, particularly those that seemed designed to test or undermine her authority. At the same time, she redoubled her efforts to excel in every aspect of the training program. The next exercise provided an opportunity to demonstrate her capabilities under different circumstances. The scenario involved commanding a simulated infantry company during a complex urban raid designed to capture high-value targets while minimizing civilian casualties and collateral damage. Sarah found herself assigned as the company commander, responsible for planning and executing the entire operation. It was the highest level of responsibility she had been given in the program, and she knew that her performance would be scrutinized closely by both instructors and fellow officers. The planning phase required coordinating multiple specialized teams, assault units, snipers, explosive ordnance disposal specialists, and intelligence analysts. Each team had specific capabilities and limitations that needed to be integrated into a coherent operational plan. Sarah approached the planning methodically, consulting with subject matter experts and drawing on her previous combat experience. She paid particular attention to rules of engagement, civilian protection measures, and contingency plans for various scenarios that might develop during the raid. Captain Wilson was assigned to her planning team as the aviation liaison, responsible for coordinating helicopter support and extraction operations. Sarah watched him carefully during the planning process, noting his contributions while remaining alert for any attempts to undermine her authority. "Captain Mitchell," Wilson said during one planning session, "I think we should reconsider the timing of the helicopter insertion. The noise signature could compromise operational security if we approach too early." Sarah had anticipated this concern and had already developed a solution. "You're right about the noise issue, Captain Wilson. That's why I've coordinated with the aviation unit to use noise-dampening flight paths and approach the target area simultaneously with diversionary operations in adjacent sectors." Wilson reviewed the plan details and nodded slowly. "That should work," he admitted. "It's a more complex coordination challenge, but it addresses the security concerns." The exchange was professional and focused on operational effectiveness rather than personal authority. Sarah noticed that other officers observed the interaction with interest, particularly noting Wilson's acknowledgement that her approach was sound. As the exercise preparation continued, Sarah found herself working effectively with officers who had previously seemed skeptical of her capabilities. Her detailed planning, technical competence, and collaborative approach gradually shifted the dynamics within the team. The raid exercise itself was conducted at night in a realistic urban environment. Sarah commanded the operation from a mobile command post, coordinating multiple teams as they moved through a complex sequence of actions designed to capture the simulated targets. The operation required split-second timing as assault teams breached multiple buildings simultaneously, while snipers provided overwatch and helicopter teams prepared for rapid extraction. Sarah monitored communications from all teams while tracking the progress of the mission and adapting to unexpected developments. During the most critical phase of the operation, one of the assault teams reported encountering unexpected resistance that threatened to compromise the mission timeline. Sarah had to decide whether to commit reserve forces, modify the extraction plan, or abort portions of the operation to ensure overall success. "Command, this is Assault Team 2, came the radio transmission. We've got heavy resistance in Building C, request immediate support or guidance on proceeding." Sarah analyzed the situation quickly, considering the impact on other teams, the timeline requirements, and the mission objectives. She had several options, each with different risk profiles and probability of success. "Assault Team 2, stand by," she replied. "Overwatch, what's your visibility on Building C?" "Command, this is Overwatch. We have partial visibility. Count at least 4 enemy positions, possibly more." Assault Team 2 is pinned down near the main entrance. Sarah made her decision. Reserve Team, move to support Assault Team 2. Overwatch, provide covering fire. Aviation, modify extraction timeline to allow for extended engagement. The coordination required precise timing and clear communication as multiple teams adjusted their actions simultaneously. Sarah monitored the developing situation while maintaining awareness of the broader mission timeline and objectives. The modified plan succeeded, with all teams completing their objectives and successfully extracting without simulated casualties. The operation was completed within acceptable time parameters despite the unexpected complications. Major Richards appeared for the immediate after-action review, accompanied by the full team of exercise observers. Sarah noticed that their expressions suggested positive assessment of the operation's execution. Captain Mitchell, Major Richards said, "Your adaptation to unexpected circumstances demonstrated effective command decision-making. The coordination required to modify the plan while maintaining mission integrity was particularly noteworthy." The individual feedback session that followed was more positive than Sarah had experienced in previous exercises. Captain Williams, her primary evaluator, focused on specific examples of effective leadership and tactical competence. "Your planning process was thorough and professional," Williams noted. "More importantly, your ability to adapt under pressure while maintaining team coordination shows significant leadership potential." The other officers responded positively to your command style during this exercise. Sarah appreciated the positive feedback but remained cautious. She had learned that success in one exercise didn't necessarily translate to continued acceptance by all her fellow officers. The program still had several weeks remaining, with increasingly challenging scenarios designed to test every aspect of leadership capability. However, she had also noticed changes in how some officers interacted with her. The successful completion of the raid exercise, particularly her effective handling of the crisis moment, had demonstrated competence that was difficult to dismiss or minimize. Captain Wilson approached her after the exercise debrief. "Good work on the raid," he said simply. "The aviation coordination was well planned and effectively executed." The acknowledgement was brief but significant. Wilson had been one of her most persistent critics, and his recognition of her performance carried weight with other officers who had been influenced by his earlier skepticism. As Sarah prepared for the next phase of training, she reflected on the lessons learned from the recent exercises. Technical competence was necessary but not sufficient for acceptance and respect. She needed to demonstrate leadership qualities that impressed fellow officers while maintaining professional relationships despite persistent challenges to her authority. The remaining weeks would present even more demanding tests, but Sarah felt more confident in her ability to succeed. The pattern of undermining and testing was becoming more predictable, and she was developing strategies to address it while maintaining focus on performance excellence. Most importantly, she was beginning to understand that her success in the program would influence not only her own career but also the opportunities available to other women who might seek similar leadership positions in the future. That responsibility added weight to every decision and interaction, but it also provided motivation to excel despite the additional challenges she faced. The final month of the Advanced Leadership Training course brought revelations that would change everything Sarah thought she understood about her experience in the program. What she discovered would force her to reconsider not only the challenges she had faced but also the true purpose of the training she had undergone. It began during the 12th week, when Major Richards announced that the final exercise would be different from all previous training scenarios. Instead of simulated operations, the remaining 28 officers would be assigned to evaluate and provide recommendations for actual military units facing real operational challenges. "Ladies and gentlemen," Major Richards began during the morning briefing, "your final evaluation will involve working with active duty units to assess leadership effectiveness, operational readiness, and recommendations for improvement. You will be assigned to different installations and commands, where you will spend 2 weeks conducting detailed analysis and presenting your findings to senior leadership." Sarah found herself assigned to Fort Campbell, home of the 101st Airborne Division. Her specific assignment was to evaluate the readiness and effectiveness of the 2nd Brigade Combat Team, which had recently returned from overseas deployment and was preparing for their next operational cycle. The assignment seemed routine until she arrived at Fort Campbell and met with Colonel William Henderson, the brigade commander. Henderson was a decorated officer with multiple combat deployments and a reputation for demanding excellence from his units. Captain Mitchell, Colonel Henderson said during their initial meeting, "I want you to understand that this evaluation isn't just academic. We've been having some challenges with unit cohesion and operational effectiveness since our return from deployment. Your assessment could influence decisions about leadership changes and training priorities." Sarah spent the first week observing training exercises, reviewing personnel files, and conducting interviews with soldiers at all levels of the brigade. What she discovered was a unit struggling with leadership problems that seemed remarkably familiar. The brigade had recently undergone significant leadership changes. Several experienced officers had transferred to other assignments, and their replacements were having difficulty establishing authority and maintaining unit morale. More troubling, Sarah found evidence of systematic harassment and exclusion directed at the unit's female soldiers and junior officers. During interviews with enlisted personnel, Sarah heard stories that echoed her own experiences in the training program. Female soldiers reported having their competence questioned, their contributions dismissed, and their presence in certain roles treated as experimental rather than earned. "Ma'am," Sergeant First Class Maria Gonzalez told her during a private interview, "some of the new leadership acts like we're here on probation. Like we have to prove ourselves every day just to be treated like regular soldiers." Staff Sergeant Jennifer Torres shared similar experiences. The previous commanders understood that good soldiers come in all forms. But some of the new officers seem to think that having women in combat roles is some kind of social experiment they have to tolerate. As Sarah continued her investigation, she discovered that the unit's operational problems were directly connected to these leadership failures. When significant portions of a unit feel unwelcome or undervalued, overall performance suffers. Communication breaks down, trust erodes, and the kind of teamwork essential for military effectiveness becomes impossible to maintain. The revelation came during her second week at Fort Campbell, when she was reviewing personnel records in the brigade headquarters. Colonel Henderson appeared at her workspace with a folder of documents she hadn't seen before. "Captain Mitchell," he said, settling into the chair across from her desk, "I think it's time I shared some additional information about your assignment here." Henderson opened the folder and removed several documents. Sarah recognized her own photograph attached to what appeared to be a detailed evaluation report. "Your performance in the Advanced Leadership Training course has been monitored more closely than you realized," Henderson continued. "Not just your tactical competence, which has been consistently excellent, but your response to the interpersonal challenges you encountered." Sarah felt a chill of recognition. The challenges weren't coincidental, were they? "No, they weren't," Henderson confirmed. "Captain Wilson, Lieutenant Colonel Torres, and several other officers in your program were instructed to create specific types of pressure designed to test your resilience, adaptability, and leadership potential under adverse conditions." The implications hit Sarah immediately. The persistent questioning of her technical competence, the subtle undermining of her authority, the coordinated efforts to create doubt about her capabilities, all of it had been orchestrated as part of her evaluation. "The military is changing, Captain Mitchell," Henderson explained. "We're integrating women into roles and positions that have traditionally been male-dominated. The challenges you faced in the training program are the same challenges that female officers encounter in operational units throughout the military." Sarah processed this information while reviewing her memories of the past several months. Every challenge, every moment of doubt, every test of her resolve had been carefully designed to evaluate not just her tactical abilities but her capacity to succeed despite obstacles that her male counterparts would never face. "The question we needed to answer," Henderson continued, "is whether officers like you can maintain effectiveness and unit cohesion while dealing with these additional pressures. Your performance suggested that the answer is yes, but we needed to understand how and why you succeeded where others might fail." The folder Henderson shared contained detailed analysis of her responses to various challenges throughout the program. Every decision, every interaction, every moment of stress or success had been documented and evaluated by teams of psychologists, leadership experts, and experienced military officers. Your ability to maintain professional relationships while standing firm on technical and tactical issues was particularly noteworthy, Henderson said, reading from one of the evaluation reports. You demonstrated the capacity to earn respect through performance rather than demanding it through authority, while also showing resilience in the face of systematic questioning of your competence. Sarah felt a mixture of validation and frustration. Validation because her performance had been objectively successful despite the additional challenges. Frustration because those challenges had been artificially created rather than naturally occurring obstacles she needed to overcome. "Sir, why wasn't I informed that this was part of the evaluation?" she asked. "Because authentic responses required authentic pressure," Henderson replied. "If you had known that the challenges were artificial, your reactions would have been different. We needed to observe how you would actually respond to the types of situations you'll encounter throughout your career." The conversation continued for over an hour, with Henderson explaining the broader context of her assignment. The military was conducting a comprehensive study of integration challenges, seeking to understand how to better prepare both male and female officers for the realities of changing organizational dynamics. "The unit you're evaluating here has been struggling with exactly the types of issues you encountered in training," Henderson explained. "The difference is that here, the problems are real rather than simulated. We need officers who can recognize these dynamics and develop solutions that maintain operational effectiveness while ensuring that all qualified personnel can contribute fully." Sarah spent the remainder of her time at Fort Campbell developing recommendations that drew directly on her training program experiences. She identified specific leadership behaviors that created inclusive environments, communication strategies that prevented competence-based challenges from escalating into personal conflicts, and training approaches that helped all officers understand their role in maintaining unit cohesion. Her final report to Colonel Henderson was comprehensive and specific. She recommended leadership training that addressed unconscious bias, performance evaluation systems that focused on objective measures rather than subjective perceptions, and mentorship programs that helped all officers navigate interpersonal challenges effectively. "Your recommendations align closely with research conducted at other installations," Henderson told her during their final meeting. "What makes your analysis particularly valuable is that it's based on direct experience rather than theoretical understanding." Sarah returned to the Advanced Leadership Training course for the final week of the program. The experience at Fort Campbell had given her new perspective on everything that had occurred over the previous months. She now understood that her success in the program hadn't been despite the challenges she faced, but because of how she had handled them. The graduation ceremony took place on a bright morning with all 28 officers who had completed the program standing in formation. Major Richards addressed the group with remarks that took on new meaning for Sarah given what she now understood about the program's true objectives. The Advanced Leadership Training course is designed to prepare officers for the most challenging command positions in the modern military, Major Richards said. But leadership today requires more than tactical competence. It requires the ability to build effective teams from diverse personnel, to maintain unit cohesion despite interpersonal challenges, and to create environments where all qualified individuals can contribute to mission success. After the ceremony, Sarah found herself in conversation with Captain Wilson, whose role in her training she now understood completely. The conversation was awkward at first, given what she knew about his instructions to challenge her performance. "Captain Mitchell," Wilson said, "I want you to know that creating those challenges for you was one of the most difficult assignments I've ever had. Your responses were consistently professional and competent, even when I was deliberately trying to undermine your confidence." Sarah appreciated his honesty. "I understand that it was part of the training, Captain Wilson. What I learned from those experiences will help me throughout my career." "That's exactly why the program was designed this way," Wilson replied. "The military needs officers who can succeed despite obstacles that shouldn't exist but, unfortunately, do. Your performance proved that it's possible, and hopefully your success will help create opportunities for others." The conversation revealed that Wilson and the other officers involved in the artificial challenges had volunteered for the assignment because they understood its importance for the military's future. They had been carefully selected and trained to create realistic pressure without crossing lines into actual harassment or discrimination. As Sarah prepared to leave Fort Henderson, she reflected on the complex emotions generated by her experience in the program. She felt pride in her successful completion of challenging training, satisfaction at having overcome significant obstacles, and optimism about her future career opportunities. But she also felt the weight of responsibility that came with her success. The program had identified her as someone capable of succeeding in environments where female officers faced additional challenges. That meant her future assignments would likely place her in situations where she would need to demonstrate not only her own competence but also the viability of continued integration efforts. Major Richards approached her during the final checkout process. "Captain Mitchell, your next assignment will be as executive officer of a combat brigade. It's a position that will test everything you learned here, both about tactical leadership and about managing complex interpersonal dynamics." Sarah accepted the assignment with confidence earned through months of rigorous testing. She understood that her success or failure in the new position would influence decisions about other female officers seeking similar opportunities. "Sir, I'm ready for the challenge," she said. "The training program has prepared me well for whatever I'll encounter." As she drove away from Fort Henderson, Sarah thought about the female soldiers she had interviewed at Fort Campbell. Their experiences had shown her that the challenges she had faced in training were not unique to her situation. Throughout the military, qualified women were proving themselves capable while dealing with obstacles that their male counterparts never had to consider. Her success in the advanced leadership training course had been real, despite the artificial nature of some of the challenges. More importantly, it had prepared her to recognize and address similar dynamics in operational units where the consequences were measured not in training grades but in mission success and soldier welfare. The program had taught her that leadership in the modern military required technical competence, tactical expertise, and the ability to build effective teams despite interpersonal challenges that could undermine unit cohesion. She had proven her capability in all these areas, but, more importantly, she had learned how to help others develop the same skills. Sarah's experience would influence her approach to leadership throughout the rest of her career. She would work to create environments where all qualified personnel could contribute fully, while also preparing other officers to navigate the complex dynamics they might encounter as the military continued to evolve. The cadets who had tried to chase her out had unknowingly participated in her preparation for senior leadership positions. Their challenges had made her stronger, more resilient, and more effective as a leader. In trying to prove she didn't belong, they had helped her demonstrate exactly why she did.